Today I'm talking about sensor size and why it matters. Since the birth of digital cameras, and especially after the birth of the full-frame sensor, there has been an ongoing debate about sensor sizes and whether it matters or not. From people who refuse to go anything bigger than a micro four thirds sensor, crop sensor newbies, to the full-frame snobs. And weirdly, there are a lot of full-frame snobs who have a little bit more attitude than medium format users, which is kind of strange, as the whole pretense to the full-frame arrogance seen every now and then is that bigger is better. Well, size does matter, and in more ways than you might think. I have everything from a tiny sensor in my phone, a small but useful sensor in my RX10, a crop sensor in my A6600, to a full-frame sensor in my A7 III. Even though these are all Sony cameras, we're talking about the size of the sensor more than the brand today. Each of these systems can take amazing photographs, but there are a few big advantages and disadvantages to each system. And what you'll find is that for every one of these points, it all does depend on how you shoot. With large camera sensors, for a given megapixel count, the photo sites will be bigger. This gives them the chance to soak up more photons for the time that the sensor is exposed to the light, because they cover a bigger area. So let's say you have a 24 megapixel camera phone with a tiny sensor and an A7 III with a 35mm sensor. For each of those megapixels, each photo site will be physically bigger on the full frame camera than the camera phone, so each site will be exposed to more light. This then means it'll be better in low light and it will have the ability to soak up more light. Now, this has its advantages when you might be walking around a city through the evening handheld shooting whilst the light drops. But if you're a landscape photographer and predominantly shoot from a tripod at the base ISO level of your camera, it might not be as important as you think. So if you need to get the shot no matter what the conditions are, larger sensored cameras are better. Say for family parties, events and sports, this is when it does help to have a bigger sensor. And this is why pro photographers in these genres of photography will tend to have huge lenses and full frame cameras, because they want to get the best possible quality. Also, for specialized types of photography like wide field astrophotography, even though there are ways to reduce the noise by image averaging, if you like to get everything in one shot, again, large sensors are better in those low light conditions. Now, on the flip side of this, if you mostly shoot in conditions where the light is good, a camera with a smaller sensor can pretty much produce as good an image as a full frame camera and even a medium format camera. The key component comes down to knowing how to use the camera and getting the best out of it for the conditions you're in. When it comes to dynamic range, because those large sensors do have those larger photo sites, they tend to have a slightly better dynamic range than smaller sensors. So for a single shot, larger sensors will be able to get more details in the brighter and darker parts of your frame, lessening the chance of getting blown out highlights and crushed shadows. With a full frame camera, because of that bigger sensor, you do have to get some big pieces of glass for a given focal length or framing to cover that larger sensor. If you need a telephoto lens to get that reach to photograph something really far away, the lenses are ridiculously big and ridiculously expensive. But with a crop censored camera, you can have less glass and still get really close to the framing you might want and fill the frame with the subject that you're trying to shoot. So with my A7 III, I'd have to get a huge 200 to 600mm lens to match the telephoto end of my RX10 Mark III. And if I'm publishing my photos online, no one really notices the difference. In fact, a lot of my telephoto images on my social media sites have been taken with my RX10, and not one person has commented saying that it was taken with a smaller censored camera, or they didn't say shame about the quality. They just liked the photo that I took and the photo that I shared. Also, if I use my A6600 over my A7 III, I can use a lens like the 85mm and get much closer to what I want to photograph. So unless I'm on a safari, shooting from a vehicle with a tripod gimbal head to support the size of a huge lens, a crop sensor camera really does give some nice images and can get me really close to the subject. Now, this next feature is a byproduct of the system you're using more than anything. Cameras aren't that different with weight and size these days. If you look at the A7C and the A6600, they are pretty much the same size. What does change is the size of lenses, and this is because of the size of that sensor the lens needs to project onto. A full frame sensor obviously needs more glass to project that bigger image to the sensor plane compared to a crop sensor, and this is why camera phones can be so small. Those sensors are tiny, so the lens on your phone can also be really small. Whereas on a full frame camera, because the lens needs to project an image of 35.6mm by 23.8mm, the glass cannot go below a certain size, and this all adds to the weight of the system. Now, this is a section that might throw out all of the points I've already made about sensor sizes as the years go by, and this will become more and more powerful as those years go by. With the likes of camera phones gaining computing power every year, computational photography is really having an impact on what you can capture in good light, and now even in low light. These camera phones have blending features in the night mode, and it takes a series of shots and averages out those images, getting rid of noise and other issues in that photograph. And this is down to the computing power behind the lens. I think if these features came across to entry-level cameras, it would really revolutionize the entry-level cameras that we have available, and it would take everything that's powerful from camera phones and add it to a really good quality, much bigger sensor. And I think when that does happen, that's when full frame cameras and medium format cameras will kind of be under threat. With a small sensor, you will have to shoot with a wider focal length to get the same framing from a fixed position than with a larger sensor. This is why you might see that the actual focal length and the full frame equivalent focal length are different. With my RX10 Mark III, it has a 24 to 600mm full frame equivalent focal range, but the actual focal range is 8.8mm to 220mm. So an 8.8mm lens with the RX10 will give the same framing as a 24mm lens on my A7 III or any full frame camera. So this comes back to the benefits of a smaller sensor. Because the sensor is smaller, the projected image doesn't have to be as big, and therefore the physical size of the glass can be smaller, meaning that the whole system will be lighter. For a given aperture and a given focal length, you'll get a certain look to the image. But for a different sized sensor and having to change the focal length to get the same framing from a fixed position, like I mentioned in the previous point, you'll change the look of the image with the same aperture. Now, this sounds confusing, but it doesn't have to be, and I'll try to explain that now. If you have the RX10 Mark III, which has a sensor size of 13.2mm by 8.8mm against the A7 III with a sensor size of 35.6mm by 23.8mm, if I get them giving me the same framing, because the RX has such a small sensor, I'd have to use that 8.8mm lens, whereas on the A7 III, I'd be using the 24mm lens. At f2.8 with both lenses, the full frame A7 III gives a much shallower depth of focus than the RX10 Mark III. This is why camera phones have a hard time getting the background out of focus, but with that pesky computational photography coming into play, modern camera phones can actually work out what is the background and what is the foreground or subject, so they can blur out that background with a little bit of computational wizardry. This is a little bit hit and miss, but the most expensive camera phones are getting closer to producing those blurry background images. On the other hand, if you're a landscape photographer, having a deeper depth of focus does have its benefits. And even though I shoot a lot of my landscape images with the A7 III and the A7C, I also take a lot of them with my A6600 and also the RX10. So as you can see, there's no clear winner. Each system has its own use and has its own advantages and disadvantages, and every type of sensor can be really useful in certain circumstances. The way I look at it is that it's all about using the right tool for the job in hand. So instead of worrying about sensor size, brush up on your photography skills by learning something new, shooting regularly, developing the skills you have, and going out there and building on your experience with the camera that you have in hand. Now, what do you think? And what sensor size do you shoot with? Let me know in the comments below. I always try to get involved and reply to all of the comments you leave. I don't always succeed, but I do try my best. So let me know in the comments below. It'll be great to hear your thoughts. And if you like this video, try this one next. Or if you want to binge watch a load of my tutorials, click down here. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for weekly tutorials in photography. I'll see you next time.